Hello and welcome to Property Potential Podcast. Today I'm with Karen from Groundup. Karen, nice to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good. Karen, tell us a little bit about Groundup and who your typical customers or clients are. What does Groundup do? Give us a little background.
Sure, I would love to, and thank you again for having me on. Groundup is a multidisciplinary studio for the built environment, which means we do strategy, branding, design, communications for all kinds of projects in the built environment. My typical clients are real estate developers who have, a specific site that they're trying to bring to life. But I've also worked with prop tech companies, founders, a couple of municipalities, which has been incredible. Really, all kinds of leaders within the land use space that are trying to tell a story about a site or a project or a vision.
That's great. Give us a
Yeah.
little background on before Groundup. Share with us
Yes.
maybe some of the projects that you've worked on or, anything that really was special and memorable.
Yeah. Well, I had kind of an interesting path to getting where I am. I studied urban design and architecture and was pretty sure I wanted to be an architect. And kind of through some serendipitous New York moments, fell into real estate development. And it was really through that. I was at one firm, I was at Kushner for 7 years and started out as a creative director, ended up as their head of design and branding. And it was really through that I got to have the pretty unusual experience in development of having a finger in all of the pies of the creative trajectory of a project, kind of from the beginning to the end. When I started there, I think they kind of went through a typical creative process for real estate developers. They would design the building as efficiently as possible and they got a site. They would, bring on an interior designer to kind of make it look nice. And then at the end, there was a name chosen or a logo or some kind of a brand. And I think what we were really able to do as a team through my time there was totally flip the process where, a site was acquired or was in development. And we really kind of began with the story and the context and the history of the site and the positioning and what's going to make us not just stand out from a business perspective, but also, mean something to the town where we were situated. And what I saw through my 7 years there was that it actually makes such an enormous difference of course, for the community, no question, that's obvious, but also from a business standpoint, from kind of the value proposition, because all throughout the process of developing a building, there are a million small decisions that need to be made. Everything from the design and the aesthetic, are our tenants going to care more about a nicer faucet or a better countertop or this amenity, or should we pay more for this? Or, anything having to do with the operations, will they care more about having a concierge or should we have an art gallery here? All of these millions of decisions. And when you don't have the story kind of fleshed out from the beginning, those decisions could be, kind of maybe based on what other comps are doing or just, the feeling of one or two of the decision makers of the company, as opposed to starting with having this kind of creative blueprint of a project. And it allowed us to have a much easier time making, very strategic decisions about, oh, well, of course, our hotel guests are going to care about this more than this. Or, of course, the people of this neighborhood will want this over that. It will be more benefit. So I think it just opened my eyes to how beneficial it is for all the stakeholders involved to kind of have that clear vision of the soul of the
Sure.
project, a very informed soul. And then about a year and a half ago, I went out on my own and started this creative practice that really kind of aims to do just that.
Yeah, you've carved out quite a niche. I think before
Yeah,
recently, developers, it was an afterthought as to
absolutely.
positioning and branding of it. And I think now you're seeing more and more of an importance on that. So um,
Yes.
yeah, I think you definitely have hit on something. Um, let's unpack what you said because you actually covered a lot there. Um, let's say you're approaching a new project for the first time. What is your how do you start that process? How do you do your
Mm,
research? How do you begin to tell the story?
yes. Well, I would say the way I would summarize how I start is really by listening, basically looking and listening and absorbing. Anytime I'm in a new market, which is often, I start with like a really deep dive immersion, usually for 48 hours, 72 hours. Go to the site, super intensely packed 72 hours. I go to the site, I understand the context, I walk all around the neighborhood. I meet with community leaders, I meet with local business owners, kind of any stakeholders in the site itself, ownership, of course, leasing, anyone involved in the site itself, and then also in the surroundings, business owners, anyone in the city administration who's interested in the project and kind of wants to give their 2 cents. And typically what I do after all of that kind of listening and looking and absorbing is I have, kind of a sit down with the ownership of the project or any of the stakeholders. And we do kind of a charrette style workshop of brainstorming what the brand will look like, what the site wants to be, kind of what the personality of the place is, what the heart and soul of the place is. And the most amazing workshop of that style for me is when the architects are there, the ownership is there. The GC even sometimes comes, and it really gives kind of the fullest picture of what the heart and soul of the site wants to be.
I think that's a great approach. And you mentioned earlier the importance of storytelling. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. What makes a good story? How do you find the
Mm.
story in a project?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll give you an example. While I was still in house, kind of in my previous life, I also, parallel to that, co founded a project called The Tanks at Bushwick Inlet Park. And it was, also kind of a magical, serendipitous New York story where I and two friends came upon this site on the waterfront in Williamsburg, where there were 10 decommissioned oil tanks. And that may not sound very cute, but actually the site was gorgeous. These tanks were enormous and kind of had gorgeous street art all over them. And it was really a magnificent site, and we kind of came together to try to pitch the city on saving them and turning them into a park. And as you can imagine, it was a hard sell,
Sure.
as, especially for community members who had grown up thinking about these tanks as kind of an eyesore and something to get rid of. And that was my first, that started in 2015. So, this was a while ago, but it was really my first lesson in storytelling. Because what I would say is that, while we were able to push the vision really far, kind of culminating in a petition of over 3,000 signatures from, the community to support this vision and kind of building a big team around it, there was a critical kind of missing component, I think, and which ultimately the city kind of came in overnight and demolished the tanks, unfortunately. But there was a critical missing component in our storytelling, I think, in hindsight, which was, very beautiful. We had beautiful renderings. We got a lot of people excited about it. But there was something in the emotion and in the history of the site and in the relationship between the community members and the tanks and their associations with it, especially longstanding community members, that we just were not addressing at all.
Mm,
And I think those kind of emotions and the feelings about the site, and especially, some of the kind of oldest stakeholders of this neighborhood, they never connected with the shiny pictures.
sure.
And that was ultimately, I think, the downfall. So for me, I think that's why I really take this approach. Obviously, also incorporates, just my personal background in urban planning and in development,
Yeah,
of not just kind of going into a site and looking at it from a branding standpoint of, okay, let's make a pretty rendering, let's make a nice logo. It is truly about the deep dive of what does this community want? What does it need? But what could growth also look like, and innovation, and kind of that like deep emotional, historical understanding leads to a story of a place that's told through the design, that's told through the branding, that's told in all of these ways, so that when the project actually launches, the community is cheering and excited and actually like has a sense of ownership over the project. Makes for a living, breathing site that hopefully is an asset for a very long time.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds incredible. What are some of your, passion projects, favorite types of projects to work on? Because, if you go to your website, you've worked
Yeah,
on tons of different projects. Do you have any projects that you really love to work on?
I do. I would say, in general, adaptive reuse projects are my favorite,
Sure.
just because they're so incredibly layered and interesting, and there's so much history, and aesthetically, they're so interesting. So, for example, I have a project I'm working on right now in New Mexico. Incredible project. The site itself is in downtown Albuquerque. It's a, decommissioned factory warehouse, and it's being transformed by this amazing new kind of national company called Roadrunner Venture Studios that's creating its headquarters in Albuquerque. And it's been so fascinating to learn about the state and the site, which obviously, has a history of innovation. New Mexico does history of innovation for the U.S., kind of biblical
Sure.
proportions. And what Roadrunner is doing is they're going to bring in these scientists and, the incredible minds of New Mexico and bring them in through this incubator to help them commercialize their research and their development and their ideas. So I think bringing in, that legacy of scientific innovation, along with kind of a downtown that has seen better days, but has so many local community members kind of, by their bootstraps trying to revitalize the downtown. And so helping to be kind of a node in that constellation, and just using all of that as inspiration for what happens inside of the space, the programming, the aesthetic, and kind of the brand and how it all comes to life, has been so interesting. And I think that's true of so many adaptive reuse projects.
When do you recommend developers start thinking about engaging you
Mm.
in a project? There's so many moving parts or so many different stakeholders. Uh, when do you recommend, or what do you tell prospective clients as to, here's what the process looks like, here's when we should start thinking about our brand, our story?
My answer is unequivocally as early as possible. Again, just because of kind of that, what I'm trying to, inform as that flipped process. Um, what I would say is, I think sometimes, I've had um, it's been interesting, like explaining the full scope of what I do because creative direction and real estate development, it's not always something that you think of together. I think creative direction is something that's usually more associated with a retail product or a fashion house or, other kinds of products like that, as opposed to a real estate project. So normally when people think creative, they think, oh, well, we need a brand. Okay, that just comes at the end when we need to start leasing or something like that. I think what I'm, really pushing for is this idea of establishing the creative kind of heart and soul and vision as early as possible in the project because it's something that is informative throughout the process as opposed to something that just kind of reflects back whatever decisions have been put together, up to the end of the project. And I think it's something that has been done by hospitality, obviously.
Sure.
Historically, hospitality fully embraces that kind of sequence of events. Like, for example, I've worked with Marriott on several projects, and for their, tribute and autograph collections, they actually, they bring on the interior designer, etc., but they usually don't start on interior design until brand positioning is finished. And I think as developers need to find ways to differentiate their products more, and I think the public is becoming more and more and more sensitive to place making stories and the experience of being in a place. And as that becomes more and more important, I think developers of all types of product, especially multifamily, but really anything, office, and trying to convince people to come back to the office, retail experiences, public spaces, will take much more of that hospitality approach of kind of like a story first approach.
Very interesting. Are there any trends right now that you're seeing that, can't be ignored? Is there anything that that's kind of like at the cutting edge, whether it's sustainability or other,
Mm.
technology innovations? Is there anything that you recognize as, wow, this is going to be something much bigger?
Yes, I would say that I have many people coming to me now that are in the kind of, typical multifamily development space that are saying, okay, we want to, we're developing these apartments, whatever, but we want to have a brand for our portfolio of 5 buildings, 10 buildings, sometimes even more than that, where residents feel loyalty to our brand. Because of course there are brands in multifamily. There's Greystar, Toll Brothers, this, but in terms of having a loyalty, if you're moving to a new city, if you're traveling, if you need kind of shorter, longer term stay, whatever it is, there are these multifamily developers that are building product that's much more flexible in terms of the lease term because they're kind of recognizing that people, want to stay in one place for a month and then maybe another place for 2 years, and then they have to go somewhere for 3 weeks. And they want people, just like how you have, devoted Marriott Bonvoy members and things like that. They want to build brands that are, well, the element that's exciting for me is they want to build brands that, of course, are memorable, are impactful, but that actually are incorporated into the design guidelines of what they're building as well. So the brand is not just, the logo or the colors. It's really, what do our units look like? What do our amenities look like and feel like? It's full circle.
Sure. You work on so many different types of projects, and each one has its own story to tell. I'm wondering,
Yes.
do you personally have an affinity towards a certain type of design or style,
Mm.
or, or I'd even love to hear maybe about the name Groundup, where that originated from, because I'm sure that there was some
Yeah.
thought into, the name, obviously, and the branding of your own company.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start with the latter question. Ground up comes from um, the it was meant to encompass any new spark of an idea. In other words, obviously ground up development, but also, to attract founders, new companies, new kind of out of the box ideas, for any kind of product in the built environment. When I started out, I kind of knew that I would be working with developers. That's what's in my blood, and that's kind of what I know very well. But was surprised to see, kind of before I even solidified my branding, that I had a bunch of entrepreneurs and kind of people in prop tech coming to me. I think especially because they often cater to real estate developers and those are their clients. So my background in development was helpful to them. So when I was forming my own identity and my own, name and face of my company, I didn't want it to be something that was only about one specific site or one specific, piece of dirt. I really wanted it to be kind of any idea that's being built from the ground up. And I think that was also very important to me because what I love is being able to tell the story as much as possible from the inception, from the beginning of that. Okay, we have this site or we have this idea, and how is the story going to be told?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Um, in terms of other inspiration that you get, where do you draw from? Where do you find the ability to really get creative? Some people, take long walks. Where do you, or maybe they read books or listen to other podcasts. Where do you
Yes.
find your creative energy?
Well, I was going to say, first of all, listening to your podcast, obviously,
Thank you.
number one source of inspiration. Well, I'll answer this and I guess your previous question at the same time. Um, I definitely have, I would say, a direction of minimalism. I would say that that really is, I like to tell the story in the simplest way possible because I think that that's the most impactful. And then, on the basis of kind of this, simple, straightforward base, infusing it with the personality of the place and with other people, that are not necessarily myself, local artists, manufacturers, whoever it is. And I would say that the inspiration for that kind of layer is through travel, no question. There is no replacement to being immersed in a new place, whether it's a specific site or if I'm just traveling for fun or for a conference or whatever. I love walking around the streets, understanding a place, seeing all of the, cultural locations and restaurants and cafes and all of those things. But also like community hubs and local art shows and anything that kind of gives you a flavor of how other people like to express themselves, within the canvas of their city and take ownership over their city, show pride in their city. How do people express that and show that in different ways? That's the most inspiring because I think other people on a grassroots level will always have better ideas than I will. So I
Travel
love being
certainly
inspired by
seems to
that.
be a great source of inspiration. Another guest on my podcast also said the same thing. Travel, and you recently made the move from New York to Austin. Tell me a little
Yes.
bit about, how it's going so far. What are some of the things you really like
Mm.
about Austin? And obviously there's a lot of the city itself has a lot of identity. Would love to know a little bit about your journey there and how it's going.
Sure. It's been amazing, I would say. I mean, I will always kind of be a New Yorker in my heart, and so I like to go back as much as I can. But Austin is an incredibly fascinating city. It's this amazing combination of um, gorgeous natural landscape, the lake, the hills. It's also a university town, obviously, but then it has unbelievable culture with South by Southwest and film and music, live music, obviously. So that has been amazing. At the same time, it also, for all of the headlines Austin gets, it really has kind of a small town vibe. And so there's some infrastructure that maybe, was not prepared for the influx of people like me who are showing up in Austin. But I think the most interesting thing about the move actually has been kind of understanding the dynamic between the different Texas cities
Mm,
and, how the cities kind of see their identity in relation to the other cities. I haven't real I've seen that in a few other states, but never as clearly as in Texas. Like for example, I had a project in San Antonio. I was working on the on a historic hotel by the Riverwalk, and so I was doing my, typical immersion there. And so I was speaking with, local chefs that own some restaurants and business owners, just people who live there. And there was this clear feeling of don't Austin my San Antonio.
mm.
Everyone was kind of like actually had this pride of we're not developing at such an enormous rate and we have this amazing heritage and we want to hold on to it. But then I also heard from other members of community like, well, yes, we want to hold on to it, but there's also room for growth. So it's just been interesting to see how the cities are kind of comparing themselves to each other and learning from each other, but also seeing what they want to do differently. And how some cities, I think, like Austin, are telling their story very clearly to the world as opposed to other cities that actually have an enormous amount to offer. I think, like Houston, for example, but still, for some reason, some people who have been to Houston love Houston. Some people who have not been to Houston, kind of think of it as this concrete highway place because they've never been there. So it's been very interesting to see how they're identifying themselves and how they're telling their story of their identity to the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, great answer. All these Texas cities are also different. Um,
Yes.
yeah, tell me a little bit about where you see yourself and Groundup, and let's say 5 years, 10 years. What does the future look like?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have to say, just kind of as a young-ish entrepreneur, it's interesting because I think a lot of people, especially my age, when they think about starting a business, it could be very intimidating because you immediately think, oh, well, I'm going to have to hire a bunch of people. I'm going to need an office space. I'm going to need to do this and this. How am I going to have that money? And I've actually kind of fallen into a model that has worked great, I would say, and probably would help a lot of other people. But I wouldn't restrict it to anyone who wants to start a company, which is that I'm the only full time employee. And then every time I work on a project, I kind of bring on a small army of sharpshooters that are
Mm,
specifically perfect to that project, and it kind of allows me to not have any excessive overhead because anybody I bring on is being paid for by the project.
sure.
And it also allows me to bring on the perfect people for what that client needs, as opposed to kind of just making whoever I've brought on fit to a specific project. So all of that is to say that at this moment I'm very flexible. I feel very free. And my dream for Groundup, right now we're working on kind of very site specific projects for the most part, I would say. And the dream for me definitely would be to go to more of a municipal scale, and to be able to work with more kind of cities as a whole, which is my true passion and what any even site specific project that I have, I always view through that lens. Um, and I think a lot of cities could do, some cities do an incredible job, but many cities could do a better job of really telling their authentic story, especially in an age when a lot of people, not everyone, but many people have the privilege of being able to choose where they live, being able to not necessarily being grounded by one job. When you think about it in that way, cities are really becoming kind of products in a way and offerings. And I would love to be able to, expand more to that scale.
That's great. It's been a pleasure to have you on today. How can folks listening to this get in touch with you? What's the best way um,
Oh,
to reach out to you? And we'll obviously have something here on the podcast itself, but for those that would like to
yeah,
get in touch with you about Ground Up.
absolutely. The best way is just through my website. It's groundupideas.com. So you can, we have a contact there, it goes directly to me. So that's a great way to reach out. I also have a very nerdy newsletter that goes out on Fridays, having nothing to do with Ground Up. It's just about cool things happening in the built environment. So want to invite your listeners to follow that as well.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts? Anything else you'd like to share with us?
Oh my goodness. I think my final thought, which I through my work have had the honor to do in so many different cities, is I think a lot of people get kind of into their own little bubble in whatever city or place they're living in. And I think I would just encourage your listeners to go out of their comfort zone, be kind of a tourist in your own city, go meet people, get involved with your city. It will only make it more beautiful and vibrant.
That's a great way to end it. Karen, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Till next time.